In the far reaches of space, far beyond the mapped regions of known civilizations, there existed a small, quiet planet. It was almost invisible, hidden in the darkness between two bright stars, and many space explorers would have passed it without even noticing. Yet, something extraordinary was happening there, something that would soon catch the attention of the most fearsome beings in the galaxy. The planet itself seemed ordinary at first glance. Its surface was rocky and uneven, dotted with small patches of water that reflected the dim light of its distant sun. There was life on the planet, but it was fragile and delicate, nothing like the dominant, powerful species that inhabited more advanced worlds. The beings living here were intelligent but had only just begun to understand the complexities of the universe. They had communities, tools, and simple machines, but nothing to rival the massive fleets or weapons of more advanced civilizations. One day, without warning, a strange event occurred. Deep within the planet's highest mountain ranges, a sudden burst of energy lit up the sky. The locals had no idea what it meant, but the energy quickly organized itself into a signal. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, a series of intricate patterns, flashes of light, and bursts of energy that repeated over and over. The signal seemed to reach far into space, carrying a desperate message. It was a call for help, a plea from a species on the brink of extinction. Meanwhile, in the more technologically advanced regions of the galaxy, the signal was noticed almost immediately. Space monitoring stations, manned by scientists who spent their lives tracking cosmic phenomena, detected something unusual. At first, they thought it was a natural event, perhaps a solar flare or a cosmic storm, but the patterns were too precise, too deliberate. It didn't follow the random chaos of nature. There was intelligence behind it, a mind trying to communicate across the vast emptiness of space. The scientists watched in awe, trying to decode the message. Each flash and pulse seemed to carry emotion, a sense of urgency that made their antennas vibrate. The scientists, who were used to studying stars and planets, had never encountered a signal that seemed so alive, so desperate. They analyzed it from every angle, using every tool at their disposal. Computers tried to translate it into understandable language, but the message was unlike anything known. It was as if the sender had no words, no conventional way of speaking, but still wanted to communicate every ounce of fear and hope they felt. Far from the scientists and their instruments, the beings who sent the signal could do nothing but wait. They were aware that their world was in danger. Enormous storms, violent seismic activity, and predators from nearby territories threatened their cities. Their resources were dwindling, and they knew that if help did not arrive soon, their species might disappear forever. They had never sent messages beyond their planet before. They had never even dreamed that anyone would notice. But now, with their backs against the wall, they had no choice. They concentrated all their remaining energy into the signal, amplifying it, stretching it as far into space as possible, hoping that anyone would receive it. Among those who received it were the Death, a civilization feared across the galaxy for their power, ruthlessness, and advanced military capabilities. Unlike the fragile species sending the SOS, the Deathworlders lived for conquest, exploration, and domination. Their fleet was legendary, known for its speed, precision, and deadly efficiency. They were not known for mercy or compassion, yet their sensors picked up the signal, and it immediately caught their attention. The SOS was unusual, a plea that resonated in ways they rarely encountered. There was potential here, both for risk and opportunity, and the Deathworlders were always drawn to situations that promised challenge. On the flagship of their fleet, the Deathworlder commanders gathered to discuss the signal. Massive screens filled the room with visual data streams of energy pulses, patterns, and strange coordinates. The commanders studied the signal carefully, debating its meaning and origin. Some argued that it was probably a trap, a lure set by an enemy to draw them into danger. Others believed it was genuine, sent by a species too weak to survive on its own. The room was filled with tension as the leaders weighed the risks. Sending a fleet into unknown space could expose them to threats they had never anticipated, but ignoring it could mean missing an opportunity to assert power, gather information, or even claim new territory. Finally, after hours of discussion and analysis, the Deathworlder commanders made their decision. The signal was genuine, and its origin planet was worth investigating. Not only could they learn about a new species, but they could also demonstrate their presence, remind the galaxy of their strength, and perhaps turn a desperate plea for help into a strategic advantage. Orders were sent throughout the fleet, and ships began to mobilize, engines roaring to life as they prepared to cross vast distances of space. Back on the SOS planet, the inhabitants were unaware of the Deathworlders' deliberations. They continued sending the signal, hoping against hope that someone would respond. Nights were long, and the stars seemed endless, but still they broadcast, repeating the message over and over. They could not see the fleet that would soon approach them, could not know the terrifying might of those who would answer their call. Yet somewhere deep inside, they felt a faint glimmer of hope, a belief that someone, somewhere, might be listening. The universe is vast and indifferent, filled with stars, planets, and civilizations that barely notice each other. Yet, in this moment, a fragile species and a legendary warfaring civilization were about to converge. A single signal, a desperate plea sent across impossible distances, would change the lives of many forever. The energy of hope and fear intertwined, carrying through the void of space, until it reached the ears of those who could respond. The Deathworlders fleet began its journey, a shadow moving across light years, engines burning brightly as they navigated through asteroid fields, nebulae, and gravitational anomalies. Inside their command ships, the commanders studied the signal with fascination. They marveled at the ingenuity of the senders, even if those beings were weak and fragile compared to themselves. In many ways, this was a puzzler challenge that the Deathworlders enjoyed solving. They had seen countless civilizations rise and fall, but this one was different. It called to them, not with arrogance or defiance, but with a raw, desperate honesty that demanded attention. As the fleet traveled, the SOS planet continued to broadcast its message. The inhabitants were unaware of the ships moving closer, their massive size hidden by the vastness of space. Their world trembled under natural disasters. Their people fought to survive each day, and their hope flickered like a fragile candle in the wind. Yet, unknowingly, their plea had been heard, and the most feared civilization in the galaxy had taken notice. The SOS planet waits, fragile and vulnerable, while the Deathworlder fleet approaches, powerful and inevitable. In the darkness of space, the fate of the weak and the strong is about to collide, setting the stage for events that will reshape their worlds forever. The universe watches, silent but attentive, as the fragile signal carries its promise of change across the stars. The Deathworlder fleet moved through the emptiness of space like a predator gliding silently before striking. The ships were enormous, armored, and armed with weapons that could obliterate entire planets. Their engines left streaks of bright light, cutting through the darkness of the cosmos. Every officer, every crew member, was focused and alert. The mission was unusual and, like their typical conquests, this time they were responding to a signal of desperation rather than a call to battle. Yet, the Deathworlders were never without caution. They prepared for the unknown because the universe was full of surprises, and even the most advanced civilizations could be caught off guard. Inside the command ship, the central hub was alive with activity. Holographic displays projected images of the SOS planet, its coordinates, and energy signatures. The commanders studied every detail, analyzing the terrain, climate, and possible defenses of the inhabitants. To the Deathworlders, this species was weak, fragile, almost insignificant when compared to their own might. But weakness did not mean even the smallest sparks could ignite the largest fires, and the Deathworlders had learned this lesson through centuries of conquest. Meanwhile, on the SOS planet, the alien inhabitants were struggling with their daily survival. The planet was not only fragile but hostile. Violent storms frequently swept across their cities, toppling structures and flooding entire communities. Seismic activities shook the ground without warning, cracking buildings and creating deep fissures. Predatory creatures from nearby regions prowled the wildlands, threatening anyone who ventured too far from the safety of their settlements. Food and resources were scarce, and the people had learned to ration carefully, always planning for the next disaster. The beings who had sent the SOS were clever and resourceful. Despite their limited technology, they had developed communication devices that could amplify energy over long distances, carefully designed to broadcast their message into the emptiness of space. Every day, they monitored the signal, watching the stars, hoping that anyone would respond. Their species had faced extinction before, but never in such a direct and immediate way. Each person knew that the survival of their civilization depended on the success of this call. As the Deathworlder fleet approached, their ships scanned the planet repeatedly. Their sensors detected movement, life forms, and energy patterns. Unlike humans or other civilizations that relied on intuition or luck, the Deathworlders trusted technology and strategy. They analyzed every pulse of energy, every emission from the SOS signal, calculating probabilities, predicting outcomes. For them, preparation was everything. No fleet moved blindly. No mission proceeded without understanding the terrain, the enemy, and the potential risks. The Deathworlder commanders held discussions in the High Council room of the flagship. Some officers argued that the SOS signal might be a trap, lure designed to draw them into danger. Others insisted that ignoring a genuine plea for help would be a mistake, a waste of opportunity. They debated the potential outcomes, the chance to study a new species, the possibility of creating allies, and the risk of falling into ambush. In the end, the consensus was clear. They would continue their mission, but they would do so with extreme caution. Every ship was prepared for combat, every weapon primed, every maneuver calculated to the smallest detail. Back on the SOS planet, the alien inhabitants sensed changes in the stars. For weeks they had sent out their signal, their hope growing fainter each day. Then, suddenly, strange lights appeared in the sky, lights that moved steadily and deliberately toward them. No one had ever seen anything like it. Children pointed in wonder, elders whispered prayers, and scientists rushed to their observation towers. The lights were enormous, too large to be natural phenomena, too organized to be coincidences. They were machine ships, perhaps, coming in response to their call. The first contact was filled with fear and fascination. The aliens had no way to understand the size, the power, or the intent of these approaching vessels. They prepared for the worst, gathering supplies, reinforcing shelters, and strategizing how to protect their families. At the same time, they wondered if help had truly arrived or if this was the moment they had most feared: the arrival of predators from beyond their stars. Every heartbeat was a mix of anxiety and hope. Inside the Deathworlder fleet, the approach to the planet was deliberate and precise. The fleet spread out, scanning for potential threats in orbit and on the surface. Reconnaissance ships moved ahead, mapping the terrain, detecting energy sources, and identifying locations where the SOS signal originated. The commanders observed carefully, noting the fragile nature of the structures on the planet. The aliens were clearly primitive, yet intelligent. Their society had organization, cities, and communication systems. Though rudimentary by Deathworlder standards, the Deathworlders recognized a critical fact: any sudden or aggressive move could destroy the fragile inhabitants. Even a minor miscalculation could wipe out the species that had sent the SOS. This required restraint, a level of discipline not always necessary in their usual missions of conquest. They had to act like guardians and not just warriors, a role that was unusual for them. Despite their reputation for violence, the Deathworlders were strategic thinkers, and they understood that saving the species would require both caution and calculated force. On the planet, the inhabitants continued their desperate preparations. They could see the massive ships in orbit, their shadows stretching across mountains and valleys. Some tried to send signals back, unsure if the visitors could understand their language or intentions. Others fortified shelters and gathered essential supplies. Despite the fear, hope blossomed like a fragile flower in their hearts. Perhaps, just perhaps, help had arrived, and their species could survive the looming disasters. The journey of the Deathworlder fleet toward the SOS planet was also a journey of understanding. The commanders studied every detail, learning about the fragile ecosystem, the patterns of life, and the energy signatures that indicated civilization. They shared observations and debated strategies. The fleet's sensors captured the beauty and fragility of the planet: the forests, the rivers, the cities barely clinging to existence. They realized that while the inhabitants were weak, they were intelligent and resourceful, and that intelligence, not size or strength alone, determined survival. As the fleet drew closer, internal tensions emerged among the Death. Some officers questioned why they were risking resources on a weak species, while others argued that responding to a SOS could yield long-term advantages. They discussed diplomacy, strategy, and survival, weighing each decision carefully. Unlike the aliens, who acted out of desperation, the Deathworlders acted out of calculation. Their every move was planned, every choice deliberate. This was not a matter of emotion. It was a test of logic, strategy, and foresight. Meanwhile, the inhabitants continued to broadcast their signal, amplifying it as much as their technology allowed. Their hope and desperation intertwined, creating pulses of energy that traveled across the stars. They were unaware of the Deathworlder fleet's internal deliberations, the calculations, and the strategies being formed. To them, the universe seemed vast and indifferent, yet the very act of sending their signal had triggered an event that would change their destiny forever. The tension built steadily. Nights were filled with anxious waiting, as the inhabitants of the SOS planet watched the sky. Every movement of the distant ships was scrutinized, every light interpreted as either a threat or a promise. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders positioned themselves strategically, circling the planet in precise patterns, ready to react to any situation. They were prepared for battle, yet the goal of this mission was not destruction, it was observation, understanding, and, if necessary, intervention. In this delicate phase, both civilizations were learning about each other without yet meeting directly. The fragile aliens realized that someone had heard their call. The Deathworlders realized that there was intelligence and potential in this tiny species, despite its weaknesses. Both sides, in different ways, were preparing for contact. The universe watched silently as hope, fear, and strategy collided across the void of space. The SOS planet, fragile and threatened, is about to meet a fleet of beings whose power is unmatched, whose discipline is legendary, and whose intentions are calculated. The aliens cling to hope, unaware of the true nature of those approaching. The Deathworlders move with purpose, assessing every detail, ready to make decisions that could determine life or death. The anticipation hangs heavy in the cosmic silence, a prelude to the moment when two very different civilizations will finally meet, and the fate of a species will hang in the balance. The moment the Deathworlder fleet entered orbit around the SOS planet, the tension in space was palpable. Massive ships, gleaming in the light of the distant star, spread across the sky like predators circling their prey, though in this case, the prey was a civilization calling desperately for help. From orbit, the Deathworlders could see the alien cities, small and delicate, dotted across valleys and plains. Buildings were made of materials that seemed fragile and temporary, yet the inhabitants had built them with care, creating a civilization that had survived despite the harshness of their environment. That the aliens on the planet could barely comprehend what they were seeing. The massive ships, their shadows stretching across the landscape, seemed like gods descending from the heavens. Panic and awe swept through the cities. Families clutched each other tightly, unsure whether the ships meant salvation or destruction. Scientists and leaders of the SOS species tried to send signals of peace, waving antennas, flashing lights, and broadcasting messages repeatedly. They had learned a little from observing the stars, but nothing could have prepared them for the enormity of what approached inside the Deathworlder flagship. The commanders studied the planet's surface with careful attention. Every signal, every movement, every form of energy was tracked and analyzed. The fragile species below exhibited intelligence. They moved with purpose, organized in their actions, communicating among themselves. Despite their weakness, the Deathworlders recognized that these beings could survive through intelligence, not brute force. It was a stark reminder that strength alone did not define value in the universe. The first attempt at communication was delicate and tense. The Deathworlders broadcasted signals in patterns designed to test comprehension, sending sequences of lights and pulses across the planet. The aliens struggled to understand, their primitive technology struggling to interpret the complex messages. Misunderstandings began immediately. The SOS inhabitants feared that the approaching fleet might be an invasion, their first instinct to hide or protect themselves from annihilation. Panic spread in some cities as families abandoned streets and ran toward shelters. Others tried to signal goodwill, waving lights and antennas to show that they were not a threat, even from orbit. The Deathworlders could sense the fear and uncertainty. They observed behaviors, trying to interpret intentions, but the fragility of the species made the task delicate. A single mistake, a too close approach, a misinterpreted energy pulse could result in catastrophic consequences. They were aware that their very presence could be terrifying, and they had to act with precision to avoid causing harm unintentionally. Every commander and officer knew the stakes. They had to assess without aggression, understand without assumption, and decide without emotion clouding logic. The aliens tried to explain their plight. Small signals were sent in repeated bursts, carrying energy patterns that represented danger, survival, and hope. They hoped the Deathworlders could understand the desperation, the imminent threat to their lives and civilization. Storms were growing in intensity. Tectonic activity threatened to collapse cities, and predators lurked in surrounding lands. The aliens' world teetered on the edge of disaster, and their SOS was a lifeline. For a species used to being isolated, the thought that beings from beyond the stars could respond was both astonishing and terrifying. As hours passed, the Deathworlders conducted careful scans of the planet's cities. They noted the locations of energy sources, the flow of life, and even patterns of survival that the SOS species had developed over centuries. Despite their fragility, these aliens demonstrated adaptability, creativity, and intelligence. The Deathworlders began to realize that although the species was weak physically, it possessed traits that could be valuable if nurtured correctly. It was an unusual revelation. Rarely did they encounter species whose survival depended more on ingenuity than on power. Tension remained high on the planet itself. Misunderstandings threatened to escalate. Some communities believed the fleet was coming to conquer, and they prepared for resistance, fortifying shelters and preparing rudimentary defenses. Others, sensing the sincerity of the SOS response, tried to communicate peace, broadcasting signals and patterns that they hoped would be recognized. Fear and hope clashed in their minds, each individual weighing whether the approaching fleet represented salvation or doom. The Deathworlders continued their observations, carefully choosing how close to approach. Smaller craft were sent down for reconnaissance, hovering silently over cities, scanning energy signatures, and monitoring responses. The inhabitants below were awestruck, some running in terror, others attempting to signal understanding and peace. The Deathworlders noticed patterns of intelligence. They could see leaders coordinating communication efforts, individuals working together to protect one another, and communities adapting to sudden, unprecedented circumstances. These signs were subtle but unmistakable. They indicated a species that, although weak, had remarkable resilience. A delicate balance emerged in the standoff. The aliens remained alert, cautious, and fearful, while the Deathworlders maintained control, observing and analyzing without immediate interference. It was a tense dance across the void of space, every action measured, every reaction studied. The Deathworlders knew that contact could not be rushed. The fragile nature of the SOS species meant that impatience could destroy everything. At the same time, the inhabitants below were desperately hoping for help, their lives dependent on understanding the intentions of the massive beings above. In this critical phase, the Deathworlders decided to conduct a controlled test of interaction. They transmitted sequences of energy pulses designed to mimic natural phenomena on the planet, hoping to gain the trust of the SOS species. The flashes of light, patterned and deliberate, created a rhythm that gradually caught the attention of the inhabitants. Slowly, they began to recognize intention behind the signals, not just random flashes, but deliberate communication. Excitement and cautious hope spread through the cities as they realized that these beings were responding, and that the SOS signal had indeed been heard. Even with the recognition of intent, fear lingered. The inhabitants had never seen anything so immense, so alien. Children hid behind elders, animals scattered, and communities whispered among themselves. Yet at the same time, a spark of hope grew. Perhaps, after generations of struggle and survival, salvation had arrived. Perhaps the desperate plea that had been sent into the emptiness of space had found a response, one powerful enough to change the course of their existence. Inside the Deathworlder fleet, the commanders debated next steps. Some advocated for sending larger craft down to the planet's surface, believing that direct presence would ensure compliance and understanding. Others argued for caution, suggesting that even minimal interference could trigger panic or chaos. They weighed every possibility: environmental disasters, misunderstandings, potential threats, and long-term consequences. Ultimately, the decision was made to maintain observation while carefully guiding communication, allowing the SOS species to adjust to their presence without fear. The hours stretched into days. Communication between the fleet and the planet became more precise, more intentional. The aliens began to mimic the sequences sent by the Deathworlders, learning the patterns and responding in kind. A fragile understanding began to form, a silent agreement that both sides would attempt to comprehend one another. For the first time, the inhabitants felt that their survival might actually be possible, that their species could continue despite the disasters threatening their world. In orbit, the Deathworlders recognized the significance of this fragile bond. While they were known for destruction and dominance, they also had the capacity for strategy and calculation that could save lives. They had encountered intelligent species before, but rarely one so weak physically yet so resilient mentally. The SOS species had demonstrated ingenuity, courage, and the will to survive, traits that Deathworlders respected even if they rarely admitted it. The first contact phase concluded with a tense but promising understanding. Neither side fully trusted the other yet, but communication had begun. The aliens had learned that their SOS signal had reached someone capable of responding. The Deathworlders had observed a species with potential, recognizing both the fragility and strength inherent in their intelligence and resilience. The stage was set for the next phase: decisions that would test the morality, strategy, and power of the Deathworlders while determining whether the SOS species would survive the coming challenges. This was a moment of transformation. The SOS planet, once isolated and vulnerable, had been noticed by a civilization of unmatched power. The fragile inhabitants had begun to understand that the universe, vast and indifferent though it may seem, could respond to courage and desperation. The Deathworlders, in turn, were forced to consider more than mere strength, weighing intelligence, survival instinct, and potential for alliance. The encounter had begun, delicate, tense, and filled with the promise of both danger and salvation. The aliens had made contact, learned that their plea had been heard, and begun the tentative steps toward trust. The Deathworlders had confirmed the presence of intelligence, assessed the risks, and begun the delicate process of interaction. The universe watched silently. The vast emptiness of space now, a theater for a story of desperation, intelligence, and the first fragile connections between two vastly different civilizations. The SOS planet had barely begun to understand that help had arrived when a new wave of tension swept across its surface. The Deathworlder fleet, massive and imposing, had remained in orbit, observing, scanning, and communicating. The fragile inhabitants had started to trust, in small ways, the enormous beings in the sky. They recognized that the fleet's presence might save them from the disasters that had threatened their world for generations. But not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. Within the Deathworlder fleet, discussions were becoming heated. Some commanders believed that their mission should be purely observational. They argued that the fragile species had survived this long on their own, and interference could disrupt the natural order of things. Others were convinced that intervention was necessary. The storms, predators, and geological instability threatened to wipe out the entire SOS civilization, and inaction could be catastrophic. The debate was intense. The Deathworlders were a species built on calculation and strategy, and the decision to act or not carried weight beyond the immediate consequences. While these deliberations continued, the inhabitants of the SOS planet faced immediate danger. Storms raged with unusual intensity, tearing through forests, flattening homes, and threatening food supplies. Rivers swelled with torrential rain, flooding plains and washing away fields that sustained the population. Predatory creatures, sensing weakness and chaos, began moving closer to the cities. The SOS species had survived for centuries by adapting to hardship, but the convergence of natural disasters was pushing them to the limits. Each day was a struggle to survive, and each night brought terror as lightning split the sky and tremors shook the ground. The SOS inhabitants, though afraid, continued to communicate with the fleet. They used their limited technology to send flashes, signals, and energy patterns, in the hope that someone would understand and respond. Their attempts were imperfect, but the Deathworlders were watching closely. They observed the inhabitants' behaviors, their organization, the way leaders coordinated defenses, the small acts of bravery and ingenuity. Even in weakness, the aliens demonstrated intelligence, resourcefulness, and a will to survive that the Deathworlders respected in a calculated way. tensions aboard the Deathworlder flagship reached a turning point. Some officers argued that inaction could lead to total loss of life, potentially wasting a unique opportunity to establish influence over a new civilization. Others feared that direct action might provoke resistance or misunderstanding, creating chaos where survival was already fragile. In a rare move, the fleet's commanders decided to split their strategy into two paths. One group would continue observation and communication, ensuring that the SOS species could trust them. Another group would prepare for controlled intervention, ready to act if disaster struck or if external threats emerged. It wasn't long before a real test of this decision appeared. From beyond the SOS planet's solar system, a rival alien faction, a predatory species seeking to expand its territory, detected the vulnerable world. They had been monitoring energy emissions and noticed the activity surrounding the SOS signal. Seeing the planet as an easy target, they moved quickly, sending scouts and warships into the region. The fragile inhabitants were unaware of this danger. They had been entirely focused on their natural disasters and the intimidating fleet above. Their lives now depended on forces far beyond their understanding. The Deathworlders detected the incoming threat immediately. Their fleet moved with terrifying precision, positioning ships between the SOS planet and the approaching enemies. Weapons systems powered up, energy shields flared, and the fleet's tactical network analyzed every movement. In minutes, what could have been a devastating attack turned into a tense standoff. The rival faction realized they were outmatched by the sheer size and coordination of the Deathworlder fleet. Still, they tested defenses, launching probes and minor strikes to gauge weaknesses. The SOS inhabitants could only watch in terror and amazement, unable to comprehend the scale or power of what was happening above them at this moment. The Deathworlders' decision to intervene became clear. They unleashed controlled, precise strikes, not to destroy the planet or its inhabitants, but to neutralize the external threat. Massive energy beams and guided projectiles tore through the attacking ships with surgical accuracy. The rival alien forces had never faced opponents like this: strategic, calculating, and deadly. Within hours, the threat was neutralized. The SOS species, witnessing the power above, began to understand that the Deathworlders were not mindless conquerors. Their actions were deliberate, targeted, and, in this case, protective. Even after the immediate danger had passed, the SOS inhabitants remained cautious. They had seen power beyond comprehension, a force capable of destroying worlds, yet it had been used to protect them. Trust had to be earned slowly. Leaders of the SOS species took the first steps toward cautious interaction, sending patterns of light and energy that expressed gratitude and attempted communication. They still feared missteps. Any wrong signal could provoke disaster. Still, hope grew. For the first time, they realized that their species might survive, and perhaps even thrive, with the guidance or at least the presence of these powerful beings. Inside the Deathworlder fleet, commanders debated long-term strategy. The planet's survival had been ensured, but the SOS species was still fragile, vulnerable to natural disasters and internal weaknesses. Some officers suggested leaving immediately, having fulfilled the mission of saving the inhabitants from immediate danger. Others argued for continued observation and guidance, believing that nurturing a new civilization could offer strategic advantages. The Deathworlders were rarely concerned with altruism, but pragmatism and strategy often led to unexpected outcomes. Saving a species could mean loyalty, resources, or intelligence in the long run. Meanwhile, the SOS inhabitants began to organize themselves more effectively. Inspired by the intervention, they started creating shelters designed to withstand storms, stockpiling resources and coordinating defenses against predators. Children and adults alike learned to follow new protocols, guided by instinct and the knowledge that help had arrived. Confidence began to replace fear, though a delicate balance remained. The Deathworlders' presence was still intimidating, and the inhabitants knew that survival required careful attention to the unknown power in orbit. A subtle understanding began to form between the two civilizations. The SOS species realized that their survival depended on cooperation, observation, and adaptation. The Deathworlders recognized that even a weak species could be of strategic value if nurtured correctly. Lessons were exchanged silently through signals, patterns, and behaviors, creating a fragile but growing connection. The universe, vast and indifferent, had brought these two civilizations together, and both were beginning to understand the stakes of this unprecedented encounter. The days following the intervention were tense yet promising. The SOS inhabitants worked tirelessly to stabilize their cities, repairing structures and reinforcing vulnerable areas. Storms continued to rage, but the presence of the Deathworlder fleet acted as a deterrent to external threats. Predatory species hesitated to approach, sensing the overwhelming force above. For the first time, the SOS species felt a degree of security previously unimaginable. They began to dream, imagining a future where their civilization could not only survive but grow. Guided by the watchful eyes of the Deathworlders within the fleet, commanders continued to analyze the planet and its inhabitants. They were impressed by the species' resilience, ingenuity, and ability to adapt under extreme pressure. While the Deathworlders were known for their capacity for destruction, they were also capable of observation, strategy, and mentorship, even if these traits were rarely used in this way. The fragile SOS species had shown potential, and the commanders considered long-term possibilities, alliances, knowledge exchange, and even influence over the development of a new civilization. The SOS planet had survived its most immediate threats, thanks to a combination of alien intervention and the species' own ingenuity. Trust had begun to form, though it remained fragile and cautious. Both civilizations had learned from each other. The SOS species understood the power and intelligence of the Deathworlders, while the Deathworlders had discovered the resourcefulness and potential of a species they might have otherwise overlooked. The stage was set for the next critical moment, where choices would determine not just survival but the future relationship between two vastly different civilizations. The fragile planet below had been saved, but challenges remained. The Deathworlders had demonstrated both their power and their calculated willingness to intervene, leaving a lasting impression on the SOS species. And yet, much remained uncertain. Could trust continue to grow, or would fear and misunderstanding disrupt this tentative alliance? The answers would come in the next phase, as the Deathworlders prepared to determine the future of a species that had called out into the void and been heard. After days of tense observation, careful intervention, and delicate communication, the SOS planet was finally beginning to stabilize. The once fragile cities, battered by storms and threatened by predators, were now slowly rebuilding. People moved cautiously through the streets, repairing homes, reinforcing structures, and stockpiling supplies. Though their technology was limited, the SOS species had learned quickly. Inspired by the presence of the Deathworlders above, they worked tirelessly, motivated by hope and the realization that their lives and the survival of their civilization depended on careful planning and cooperation. The Deathworlder fleet remained in orbit, watching and calculating, yet their approach had subtly shifted. Initially they had acted purely to observe and protect, maintaining a cautious distance. But now, after seeing the inhabitants' resilience, intelligence, and determination to survive, the commanders began to consider the possibilities of guidance and mentorship. Though the Deathworlders were rarely known for nurturing weaker species, their strategic minds recognized value in cultivating a new ally. The fragile aliens below had potential, and in the grand scope of the galaxy, potential could be as powerful as raw strength. The SOS inhabitants, though still wary, began to trust. They had seen the fleet act decisively to eliminate external threats, and they understood that these beings were not arbitrary destroyers. Every action had been calculated, every strike precise, and yet the power of the Deathworlders had been wielded to protect, not harm. Slowly, they started to mimic the signals sent by the Deathworlders, learning patterns, sending intentional messages, and even experimenting with small forms of energy manipulation. Through trial and error, they discovered that communication was a two-way bridge, and each successful interaction strengthened their fragile sense of security. Meanwhile, tensions in orbit began to settle. The rival alien faction that had threatened the planet was completely neutralized, leaving the SOS species free to rebuild without fear of external aggression. The Deathworlder fleet, while still vigilant, had shifted focus from defense to observation, monitoring not just threats but the growth, adaptation, and behavior of the planet's inhabitants. The fleet's commanders held frequent meetings to discuss the progress. They were fascinated by how quickly the SOS species adapted under pressure, how communities coordinated their efforts, and how intelligence and ingenuity emerged as tools of survival in a harsh, unforgiving environment. Despite the calm, danger was never fully gone. The planet itself remained unstable. Violent weather still swept across the surface, and the ground still trembled under sporadic seismic activity. Yet, the SOS species had learned to anticipate these events, to respond with ingenuity and coordination. They had started to rebuild stronger shelters, develop new techniques for predicting storms, and train themselves to respond efficiently to crises. Every day was a test of endurance, adaptation, and survival. But with the Deathworlders observing, they felt emboldened, motivated to push the limits of their capabilities. The first real step toward a deeper alliance came when the SOS leaders initiated a more complex signal. Instead of simple patterns indicating danger or distress, they began to communicate information about resources, population, locations, and environmental conditions. This was not just a plea for help, it was a deliberate attempt to share knowledge, coordinate strategy, and build trust. The Deathworlders recognized this as a turning point. These were not passive, weak creatures. They were strategic, adaptive, and willing to learn. In their calculations, they realized that nurturing such intelligence could create a loyal ally, someone who might one day repay the investment of guidance and protection. Small but significant exchanges began to take place. The Deathworlders started sharing knowledge in controlled ways. They transmitted energy patterns that suggested techniques for reinforcing structures, predicting natural disasters, and coordinating communities. The SOS species, with limited technology and understanding, took what they could comprehend and experimented. Slowly, a dialogue formed, a silent, careful, calculated partnership that grew with each passing day. The inhabitants began to feel a sense of empowerment they had never known. as if the universe had finally acknowledged their struggle and offered a chance at survival. As trust grew, so did ambition. The SOS species started to envision a future where they were no longer merely surviving, but thriving. Fields that had been flooded by storms were rebuilt with more resilient structures. Communities formed emergency response groups, trained in anticipation of disasters. Children learned strategies for safety and problem solving. Elders shared wisdom on resource management and resilience. Every citizen, in some way, contributed to the recovery and growth of their civilization. Inspired by the presence of the Deathworlders above, in turn, continued to study the inhabitants closely. They observed how intelligence and adaptability could overcome physical weakness. They marveled at small innovations, ways the aliens had redirected water during floods, reinforced fragile buildings with minimal materials, and coordinated communities to survive environmental crises. Even though the SOS species was physically fragile, its strategic value had become apparent. The Deathworlders began to see them not just as survivors, but as potential partners in the broader galactic network, a civilization that, with guidance, could evolve into something formidable. External threats, while no longer immediate, remained a consideration. The galaxy was vast, unpredictable, and often hostile. The Deathworlders knew that protecting the SOS species indefinitely was impossible. Yet by establishing communication, guidance, and trust, they had created a species that could defend itself more effectively. This was a long-term strategy. The planet would become more resilient, the people more capable, and the relationship with the Deathworlders more robust. By investing in this species now, the Deathworlders were securing not just immediate survival, but potential strategic advantage for the future. Gradually, the inhabitants began to relax, even celebrate. Streets once empty and desolate were filled with activity. Children played in the streets under careful supervision. Adults repaired and reinforced buildings, and leaders coordinated reconstruction with a growing sense of confidence. The presence of the Deathworlders, once terrifying, became a stabilizing force. Though still massive and intimidating, they were no longer just a symbol of power. They were a bridge to survival, a source of knowledge, and a catalyst for growth. In orbit, the Deathworlders continued to refine their strategies. They adjusted patrol patterns, focused sensors on areas of interest, and analyzed the efficiency of the SOS species' responses. Each improvement, each adaptation by the inhabitants, was noted and incorporated into the Deathworlders' calculations. Slowly, a mutual understanding developed. The SOS species learned to interpret signals, anticipate actions, and work collaboratively. The Deathworlders learned to respect the resilience and ingenuity of a species that, while physically weak, had remarkable survival instincts. Months passed, and a new equilibrium emerged. The planet was no longer teetering on the brink of disaster. Storms were managed more effectively, predators avoided or deterred, and infrastructure had been rebuilt stronger than before. The SOS species had grown in confidence, skill, and intelligence. They had survived unimaginable odds, and the knowledge gained from their interaction with the Deathworlders had accelerated their development. The universe, which once seemed indifferent to their existence, had acknowledged their struggle, offering not just help, but the possibility of lasting survival. Finally, a moment arrived when the Deathworlders prepared to leave orbit. Their immediate mission, observation, protection, and strategic guidance was complete. The planet below was stable, the inhabitants resilient, and trust had been established. Though the fleet would eventually move on to other sectors of the galaxy, their influence remained. The SOS species had been empowered to continue to thrive and to learn from the knowledge imparted during the fleet's presence. As the massive ships departed, the inhabitants watched in awe. For generations they had faced disasters, predators, and uncertainty. But now they had seen power used not to destroy, but to protect. Hope had been rekindled, and their species had survived. The sky, once a symbol of fear, had become a reminder of opportunity, guidance, and the possibility of alliances beyond their wildest imagination. In the aftermath, new relationships began to form. Leaders of the SOS species documented every lesson learned, every interaction with the Death. Knowledge was shared across communities, ensuring that the next generation would benefit from the experience. Skills, strategies, and insights became part of their culture. The SOS species was no longer merely struggling to survive. They were building a foundation for the future, a civilization capable of resilience, intelligence, and adaptability. For the Deathworlders, the mission was a success in ways beyond immediate calculations. They had witnessed a fragile species rise, adapt, and survive. They had tested their own strategy, combining observation, precision intervention, and careful communication. And they had created a potential alliance that could be valuable in the long-term evolution of galactic relationships. Their reputation for power remained intact, but this mission added a new dimension, a demonstration that strategy, intelligence, and calculated guidance could be as powerful as sheer force. As the fleet disappeared into the vastness of space, the SOS inhabitants looked up at the stars with renewed wonder. They had survived, learned, and grown stronger. Their civilization had been saved, not by sheer luck, but by a combination of courage, ingenuity, and the careful guidance of beings far beyond their understanding. Though challenges would continue, they had been given a second chance, a future to build, a society to strengthen, and a story to remember for generations. The universe had responded to their SOS. A civilization had arrived, wielding terrifying power with precision, and had chosen to save instead of destroy. A fragile species had endured, learned, and adapted, and in doing so, had forged a bond, however tentative, with beings who could have ended their world but instead chose to protect it. The galaxy was vast, indifferent, and often cruel, yet in this moment, hope, intelligence, and survival had prevailed. The SOS planet entered a new chapter. The species below had survived its greatest threats, gained knowledge, and discovered that help could come from unexpected places. The Deathworlders had departed, but their influence remained. A new relationship had been formed, one of cautious trust, mutual observation, and potential alliance. Life on the planet would never be the same. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was full of possibilities, and for the first time, the inhabitants looked toward the stars, not with fear, but with hope.